But it wasn't until the 90s, actually, when the Assassination Records Review Board happened, and they started exposing a lot of the material that the original authors, like Gaten Ponzi, who I'll be talking about tonight, were able to get a better handle on the stuff that they had done previously in the late 70s at the House Select Committee on Assassinations and various other things. As Danny's indicated, and I'm sure you've read, the information has been let out to the public in just sort of dribs and drabs over a period of time. The initial news reports, a lot of them coming from, places like Life magazine, which got this 50th anniversary edition, and it's got every frame of the Zapruder film in it, their version, anyway, and the commemorative issue. Well, when they actually did put out the Zapruder film version of it, they did 3 editions, just so you know, and they said different things in each one, and they had to make sure it lined up with the results of the Warren Commission and the rest of it, which it finally did. For those of you that don't know the history of Time Life, the rest of it, the publisher Henry Luce, Claire Booth Luce, were admittedly fascists. They said so on numerous occasions. And there was evidence enough during the House Select Committee on Assassinations that Claire Booth Luce in particular was not only giving bad information to committee investigators to throw them off track, but was actually helping fund operations with William D. Pauley and a number of people through what had come to be known to the investigators of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Chicago Junta. And we'll be going through that. And they funneled over $30 million through this source in Chicago that went into the anti-Cuban, anti-Castro Cuban force. But the guy that was running Life for them was a guy by the name of C.D. Jackson, who you might have run into. And C.D. Jackson was chief of psychological warfare operations for us during World War II. And he went on to become a national security assistant advisor. I didn't know exact title during the Eisenhower administration. And he'd always been affiliated with the OSS and then eventually CIA. And then he went to work for Life, publishing things. So the head of psychological warfare operations in World War II doing this. So just a little history on that. The guy Dan is writing the second book with, I've got a lot of show and tell here today. I'm not going to devolve into, I will devolve into reading to you, but not much. So, but Danny's first book, which I highly recommend if you haven't bought it yet, The People's Advocate, is really the inside scoop on a lot of the clandestine stuff he ran into along the way with all of the cases that he covered during the Trajectory of Justice class that he did a couple semesters ago, which is very interesting, touches on a lot of this stuff and a lot of the same players that we're going to talk about here. But let me see, let's get through mnemonic devices for me primarily. And we have the primary book that most of the information about the investigation itself for the House Select Committee came from is from Gaten Ponzi, who was not the lead investigator. The lead investigator is a guy named Cliff Fenton on that, but Gaten was he got the best info, primarily because he worked for Senator Schweiker before in a subcommittee of the Church Committee, which was doing investigations on all this previously. And Schweiker was very interested in finding out what really happened. He'd done his own work sort of on the side to find out how connected Oswald was to intelligence, so he let Gaten Ponzi really just go out there, kind of do what he had to do in order to get it done with without a lot of formal reporting structure, just letting Gaten give him the information back to him. He was a reporter, investigator, he'd done this kind of work before. And so he wrote the definitive book on it, and Senator Richard Schweiker, who was, he was dissuaded eventually from getting involved further by a vice presidential potential nomination by Ronald Reagan when he was going to potentially run against Jerry Ford in '76. So Schweiker backed off from everything completely after Reagan had asked him to, potentially run with him as his vice presidential candidate if he did get the nomination in '76. But at the time, he was the only one really in the Senate that was actively wanting to pursue an investigation. So when they rolled up the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which is, Gaten Fonzie puts it, well, I guess I will read you a little bit on here. I'll tell you what they found out in a nutshell. So, go. The failure of the House Select Committee on Assassinations to fulfill its mission has not been adequately probed, and the investigation itself almost forgotten. Perhaps this lies in part from the contradictions in the committee's work, most starkly revealed in its strange conclusion that there were 4 shots, and there was a shot from the grassy knoll, but it missed. So that was their conclusion, that Oswald presumably was still the gunman, and those 3 shots came from him, and then there was one from the grassy knoll too, which they had potentially a recording of with addictive evidence that Danny has talked about before, but that it missed. So that was the conclusion they ended up coming to. There's a lot more than that, and the final report of this was, I was getting into that a little bit before when I was talking about Danny. The final report was actually written by G. Robert Blakey, who is the chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The second chief counsel, Richard Sprague, was the previous one. There's a whole story on that, I'll tell you. But the final report, after all the investigators had submitted all their information, they were all promised a chapter each, and they'd written them up, and it was 500 some odd pages that they had cranked out for this. And this was December of 1978 when they finished it up. And what had ended up happening was G. Robert Blakey just he didn't ignore it all, but he didn't use a whole lot of it, and he rewrote the whole thing. It ended up 600 and some odd pages. And he rewrote it with Dick Billings, who is now Danny's co-author for the second book. Okay, so the guy who helped G. Robert Blakey come up with the 4-shot, 1 finally missed, but most likely the mob did it theory, and was Dick Billings, who's helping Danny now at 80 years old with the second book. Dick was married to the niece of C.D. Jackson, the guy that was the publisher over here, okay, of Life magazine. So Dick Billings had been involved in a lot of investigations and a number of articles that Life magazine had done prior to this, not just about the Kennedy assassination, but he did, since he was the husband of the favorite niece of C.D. Jackson, he was trusted, and he went out on a number of operations, including one that is mentioned in the book that Danny talks about, which was largely funded or at least helped by William D. Pauley, who was the multimillionaire who had been putting money into this thing. He was also formerly our ambassador to Brazil, Peru. He's a personal friend of Allen Dulles, a personal friend of Dwight D. Eisenhower, numbers of people out there. So he'd been involved. He was also the guy who did the Flying Tigers. He helped put that all together during World War II, if you're familiar with that in history. So there's a history in our country of having these private individuals help with operations overseas, and we started doing that before there was a CIA. So there's a whole class of folks that were used to getting involved and on a deep level and with their own money. And Danny's second book will show how that sort of goes back to the beginning of the country, but we're focusing on the House Select Committee right now. So it's the committee that almost didn't happen. So I'm usually on a WebEx, so I don't have to stand under lights and talk. So when they had initially started it, nobody really wanted to do it. They had to do it because of the information that had been uncovered in the church committee about potential involvement of intelligence agencies, FBI, CIA, and so on, and also with the Rockefeller Commission. Now, the Rockefeller Commission is interesting. I mean, you can read the names of all the guys that are on it. Ronald Reagan was one of them on the Rockefeller Commission. These guys they were put together initially to find out about CIA involvement and things, and they were hoping they didn't find any. And as soon as they started finding out CIA involvement in a number of things, they backed off fast. They just shut everything down and basically handed their research off to these other folks at the House Select Committee that were going to move on and do this investigation, as did Schweiker's subcommittee. I don't know exactly what his subcommittee, other than Schweiker's subcommittee, from the church committee investigations. So Gate and Fonzie had a head start on everyone else that was doing the investigation. And when they put it together initially, there was great wrangling over who was going to, even do this. And probably the only reason that it even got off the ground at all was there were people pushing really hard to uncover what happened to Martin Luther King. So the Black Caucus was up in arms. John Stokes, I believe it was, the congressman, it was either John or Lewis, I'm not going to go back to the notes, you can find it, who was head of the Black Caucus, who ended up being committee chairman out of Congress. But the choice of who was going to be the attorney, who was going to be lead counsel, what the investigators were going to be doing, budget, all the rest of it, was given over initially to Richard Sprague, who was an attorney who became the chief counsel. But he proposed a very wide-ranging investigation wherein they used no CIA, no FBI agents or anything like that. He took one look at the Warren Commission and realized that they were essentially using the FBI. They had I believe it was 83 people involved in investigating Warren Commission. You can check on that. And they used 150 full-time FBI agents for that. So he decided he was not going to, he didn't want to use the FBI, didn't want to use the CIA, he didn't want to use any government agencies that they were going to be investigating. Because, he had seen what happened, he read the Warren Commission report and saw how very different that was from the volumes, the other 25 volumes of the Warren Commission. So if you're, just to review, the Warren Commission, there's a Warren report, I believe 888 pages. It's been published on a number of different occasions with different prefaces to it. Some a little lukewarm, some just outright condemning Oswald right out of the chute, and obviously it was this guy. And then the report, which was published 2 months before the actual findings it was based on, that set the stage for everything as far as the PR, what the public was going to think about it, all of it. But when 2 months later, the 15 volumes of testimony from 552 witnesses came out from the Warren Commission, and the 10 volumes of evidence which tracked the testimony, people that had read the report and actually bothered to read the investigative summaries and the testimony realized, as one lawyer put it, Vincent Salandria, who was one of the initial investigators, he's an attorney from Philadelphia, he said it's 7,000 footnotes of lies, is basically what he called the Warren Commission report at the time, because so little of it in the report actually matched up with the testimony itself and with the evidence itself. And so this troubled Richard Sprague. So he proposed a $6.5 million budget, independent investigators, no definite time frame, for finishing it. He at one point just said off the cuff, if you give me what I want, the $6.5 million per year, he wanted it. He shouldn't have said it because he said 2 years. At one point he laid that number down. So that became the number that stuck in everyone's mind. And what he didn't realize at the time, because he wasn't that savvy about the way, political things in Washington happen, the CIA and the FBI are going to be there after 2 years is gone. If this investigation has an end date on it, they can stall. They can just wait them out, and they can, they can do what they did with the Warren Commission investigation, which is, just wait it out. If there's a deadline on it, they know they can do whatever they want with it. Now, the deadline in the Warren Commission was actually, more or less from LBJ, was the '64 election. So we wanted that thing out before people were going to go to vote. So that came out in September, and then they waited until after the election to release the actual information on the testimony and the evidence itself. So eventually, when this report came out, there were 12 volumes that went along with this of testimony and evidence as well. And it's a similar story. You will find some good stuff in the report, and I can read that to you. And so there's some levels of this. Okay, there's the report itself and the findings that they did do, and then there's the frustration of investigators like Fonzie and the handout that I gave you. Let's see, we'll go through this. See. Christopher Sherritt, Oswald and U.S. Intelligence, the first one. He's an investigator on the committee that was looking into Oswald primarily in U.S. intelligence, and he quit. He just got so frustrated with the committee in the way that they were dodging the actual issues. The Congress people that were involved in it didn't want to be on it at all. It was a thankless job. Just opening it up potentially could cost them votes in their election. So there was no real impetus once they made sure Schweiker wasn't going to be on it. Or Schweiker was a senator anyway, but once they had formed this in the House, there wasn't really anybody on it except for Richard Pryor, who was, sort of semi-interested in what was going on, and had made some public statements to the effect of how evidence was being destroyed, particularly Army intelligence files on the assassination had been completely destroyed by that time. And so the destruction of evidence by then was pretty massive, which was telling in itself. So, but this is what Sherritt had found in his investigation, which is detailed in this book, which is called History Will Not Absolve Us by E. Martin Schatz. And the reason I started bringing these books in too was because Dayton Fonzie was sort of my lead for this. Actually, Danny Sheehan was my lead for this because I watched a YouTube video that Danny had done explaining the Kennedy assassination just as a model for conspiracies themselves, just for the structure of a conspiracy. And when he laid out, the various conclusions that I can't remember if he's mentioned, he's talked about the S team and the shooters and all that stuff, right? Well, everything that Danny said jived with this book when I read it. So I thought, this guy's onto something. Now, Danny's conclusions went far further than this book, obviously, but that was sort of my guide to going through this. So since Danny was in sync with the guy I was already reading, I just started following who he recommended. So, which leads to a book that I believe is at the top of your reading list, which is Someone Would Have Talked, and the quote on the front is from Dayton Fonzie. Among the most respected researchers of the JFK assassination, an awesomely comprehensive and impressive work of compelling validity, a must-read in the field, Dayton Fonzie, former staff investigator for the U.S. House Committee on Assassinations. So that's what he had to say about Larry Hancock's book. So I view these somewhat of a piece, because the stuff that he finishes with in here about the CIA folks at JM Wave out of Miami, in particular David Sanchez Morales, who Danny at one time or another is said was very involved in the conspiracy. He can go into more of that if he'd like to. But there's a lot of evidence, and it comes from multiple sources. There were two of his best friends in particular that had said, in effect, that he admitted not only the assassination, of Kennedy that he'd been involved in, but numbers of them all over the world. And he, in 1963, he was chief of operations of the Miami station of CIA, reported directly to Ted Shackley, who I believe Danny's discussed some things about Ted Shackley before. And Shackley was head of the whole office, but chief of operations, the operational guy for all the stuff that they were doing, anti-Castro Cuban stuff, was David Sanchez Morales. And this is information that was touched on the House Select Committee and Assassinations. And then, of course, when I'm talking about this, you can't help but drag in things from the 90s that they found out with the Assassination Records Review Board. I love to just take you back in time and give you the snapshot so you can linearly follow this thing, but it's not going to help you with your paper at all. So to some extent, you have to take that other evidence and drag it in. But the committee's findings themselves, although interesting and telling to a degree, let's see, I may read to you. So let's see if we do this. You know what, you can look up most of it actually right on. I'll just keep kind of going so you can get to the stream of consciousness here, but you can read that go out to Wikipedia, you can read what they found. But there are a number of things that go beyond, and what they talk about in here, what Fonzie talks about, is going beyond the conspiracy itself, and sort of behind the scenes. And there is another book that was written at the time, right at the time that the House Select Committee on Assassinations was ending, and that will take another device to do that. Where did I put the? Okay, sorry for being a little. Oh, there it is. Okay, what I'm going to show you. I know these guys have an idea what I'm going to show you, but I took a picture of every page of this book, and there's a reason for it, because there was only one copy in existence. And it just happened to have been in Danny's library. And the reason for that is that there was 4 highly respected researchers at the time who had since, Peter Dale Scott was one of them. He's done a lot of stuff on 9/11 as well. These guys have been, around for a long time. Scott Hoch, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his, Hoch, H-O-C-H, and I've got it, it's about close to 1,000 pages or so here, so I have to find the cover here for you. But this book, as we said, is called Beyond Conspiracy, and it, here's the cover of it. This is what, you probably can't see it that well from back there, but what this was, sort of the galley drafts of the book. It was, going to be published. They had a deal with Pocket and Signet and, a number of other people, within this publishing organization. And it's Peter Dale Scott, Russ Stetler, S-T-E-T-L-E-R, Paul L. Hoch, H-O-C-H, and Josiah Thompson. And these guys they were talking to the investigators. They had inside connections into intelligence agencies and things like that they'd cultivated over the years. And they were they wanted to get the first book out as soon as the House Select Committee had actually, published their report. So they were working on this thing feverishly. Now half this book had already been edited, proofread, everything was done on it. And so there was all these galley, drafts, just not the way it's going to be in the layout of the book, but they're just all lined up and you can read half of it. And then you get to single-sided, double-spaced, typewritten pages with all the handwritten notes for what they're doing in the corner. And the reason they stopped doing everything is the death threats were flying. These guys were all serious, from the publishers themselves to the authors themselves. And I'd found this out from I was listening to an old radio program that there were some conspiracy researchers had gotten together. There were 3 of them, and they were talking about this very book. I'm listening to this in this old recording the day I go up to Danny's office and talk about this with him. And he said, oh, well, my friend, whose name I won't mention, gave me a whole pile of stuff he'd been working on, and I haven't been able to go through it. He knew Peter Dale Scott and those guys, and so we went over in the corner, and very clearly, Danny hadn't touched this crap in 10 years probably, but it was stacks of stuff, including an unpublished manuscript by Kerry Thornley, who was a guy who served with Lee Harvey Oswald that was in there. But I'd already read enough about Thornley to know that it was probably going to be disinformation, so I didn't even bother with it because I didn't want to pollute my head with it. Over a period of time of just studying all this stuff, once you get to know the cast of characters, you could just look at it and go like, oh, I'm ready for the lie. And you can do this over a period of time because you see which group they all in, which camp they're all into. So these guys had, cranked this thing out. The death threats were flying, and they decided not to publish it. But lo and behold, there it was in Danny's office. And from what I had heard in the radio program, I had finished listening to not an hour before of this old podcast, of discussing the death threats. They had discussed the fact that even Peter Dale Scott, when he was approached about this, said there had been only one copy in existence. He had given a draft. The book had been split up into 2 parts, and he'd been given half of it to a friend of his, and he'd kept the other half, and his half had been stolen out of his office. Well, he was probably talking about the stuff that hadn't been put in galley form yet that he had, and the other half of it, this friend of Danny's, who was a book collector and so on, had glued both of the halves together, so I had the complete book to then go through and find out some of the. Danny's already told you some things that are nowhere, because he has just found out about it directly from the sources, because he's writing this book with Dick Billings, who was in the room when they were moving the frames around on easels of the Zapruder film from one spot to another to decide where they're going to go. He's a first-hand witness. Now at 80 years old, he's coming out. He's going to have some like he said, he was really upset about the whole thing because it's going to be real unfortunate Christmases and Thanksgivings and everything for the family-wise, because C.D. Jackson's a hero within their family. He was married to the favorite niece, and he's still connected to the family, but he's felt now at this time that he's putting all this stuff down. So a lot's coming out that wasn't before, and a lot of it's coming out of Danny. So you're getting things that, you're the only people I know of, other than Danny and the grad students, that even know about this right now. So how do you feel about that, anyway? Well, they've got it, and the gentleman that had possession of it has given the okay to just go nuts and copy as many of these things as you want to now. And Peter Dale Scott's still alive. I don't know about the other guys, but so there's a number of levels to this. There's a level of Wikipedia that you can read about, which reflects to some degree what the report is, but there's mistaken info in there. And then there's, you really want to dig in. I mean, here's an investigator that dug in. If you want the other book that goes along sort of with it, that's almost the companion piece, you've already got it if you bought it for the class. And let's see, there's a few other ones here. The other one that Gayton Fonzie recommends strongly is the one by James Douglas, JFK and the Unspeakable, which gives you another take on it. And there is information in each one of these that is somewhat unique. And then finally, because Gayton Fonzie, Vince Salandria, and a number of these people that were earlier investigators had started talking amongst themselves, formed their own sort of study groups and talking groups that included E. Martin Schatz and all these guys, Vince Salandria, E. Martin Schatz, although he wasn't around yet. Larry Hancock is not mentioned in this book in particular, but Gayton Fonzie does bring up the fact that he's in this group of dudes. So if you really want to dig in and find out something for your paper, these are the books to go to. And Salandria in particular, very interesting character, and he's one of the very first people that Gayton Fonzie went to see, way back in the beginning of this thing. Actually, it's easier for me to do this with mine. I love my iPad. You can see my Kindle has things like The Last Investigation and Nazi Hydra in America and Brothers and 13 Days and all these sorts of good things. Treason in America, but it's a lot of JFK stuff. As I said, 50 years I've been sort of paying attention to this thing on and off. So go to some of the first things in here that I located for you. I'm doing this, I'll get into the two primary folks that you're going to pay attention to in this, that the real useful information from the House Select Committee on Assassinations came from two witnesses. They came from Silvia Oyo, and they came from Antonio Veciana. So I'll write those down and spell it if you need it at some point. But, so Salandria. So Vince Salandria had done all this very hardcore work, and he did it mostly at his own expense. Again, a Philadelphia attorney that was just annoyed with it. He was one of the very first people that he read the Warren report. He was waiting for the testimony and the evidence to come out. He got all of that. He went all through it with a fine-tooth comb. As far as I know back then, there were only about 10 people in the country that publicly came forward and started mentioning any problems with it when they actually were comparing the testimony to the report itself. But I don't want to depress you too much out of the chute, because I don't agree completely with this position, but at the time that they were writing this book, and at the time, I'm sure that a lot of the stuff that's in Beyond Conspiracy right now is not a problem for anybody anymore. In fact, there's a lot of it, this is 30 years ago, it was 1980, that's in other books, like Larry Hancock's book and the rest of it, that's perfectly fine to know about now, but too many of the principal players were alive then, and they were in positions of power. Ted Shackley was still running things, okay, so you could be dead, if you said the wrong thing. So, from Salandria, I'm afraid we were misled, Salandria said sadly. All the critics, myself included, were misled very early. I see that now. We spent too much time and effort microanalyzing the details of the assassination, when all the time it was obvious. It was blatantly obvious that it was a conspiracy. Don't you think that the men who killed Kennedy had the means to do it in the most sophisticated and subtle way? They chose not to. Instead, they picked the shooting gallery that was Dealey Plaza and did it in the most barbarous and openly arrogant manner. The cover story was transparent, designed not to hold, to fall apart at the slightest scrutiny. The forces that killed Kennedy wanted the message clear. We are in control, and no one, not the president, nor Congress, nor any elected official, no one can do anything about it. It was a message to the people that their government was powerless, and the people eventually got the message. Consider what has happened since Kennedy's assassination. People see government today as unresponsive to their needs, yet the budget and power of the military and intelligence establishment have increased tremendously. The tyranny of power is here. Current events tell us that those who killed Kennedy can only perpetuate their power by promoting social upheaval both at home and abroad. And that will not lead to revolution, but to repression. I suggest to you, my friend, that the interests of those who killed Kennedy now transcend national boundaries and national priorities. No doubt we are dealing now with an international conspiracy. We must face the fact that, and not waste any more time micro-analyzing the evidence. That's exactly what they want us to do. They've kept us busy for so long, and I will bet, buddy, that that is what will happen to you. They'll keep you very, very busy, and eventually they'll wear you down. It had been over 10 years from the time I interviewed Andrea to our talk that long winter Sunday. Yet flying back home to Miami that evening, I sat in a dark plane and had an eerie sense of deja vu. And when I first spoke with him, I didn't quite grasp exactly what he was talking about. But I had the uneasy feeling he was advancing some awesomely frightening theories. Then it crossed my mind, perhaps this time for sure, Andrea was crazy. So that's how he started off. And I think that a lot of these initial researchers did get profoundly depressed. But I think over a period of time, you know, this information is coming out. You've got a class you're attending right here at UCSC. This is not the, I don't know if it's the first. I think there were actually other ones that had occurred. I don't know exactly what they did. This won't be the last. You know, there's enough. Ted Shackley's dead, you know, 2005, whenever it was. So the guy that was chief of, you know, clandestine operations for a lot of this stuff, and you know, the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia, all of it. This is all documented stuff, not hard to look up. It's just that, you know, when you take a hard look at it, you know, to some extent, what they've done with the Patriot Act and the National Defense Authorization Act, there's almost an honesty to it, to some extent, that they're finally just saying, yeah, we do this. This is what we do. This is how we behave. You know, and you've probably run into before, and other people have mentioned that even when they were on the Warren Commission, when Dulles was there talking about what if we bring in Hoover, what if we bring in, you know, Helms, other guys from the CIA, he just said they'll lie. I mean, even Dulles himself said he would lie. I mean, that's the charter of the CIA. It's to protect everything, national intelligence. And, you know, when you take a look at the core elements of the National Security Act of 1947, which, you know, I'm sure it's, you know, on other reading lists, so look at that guy. But it spells it out clearly, and I've got it right in here. Sorry, I gotta find the location right here. So, July 26, 1947, Congress establishes the National Security Agency to advise the President on intelligence matters. It also creates a Central Intelligence Agency with a director, and this is in quotes, subject to no supervision, control, restriction, or prohibition from the military Joint Chiefs of Staff. The leadership of the new CIA is composed largely of former members of World War II's Office of Strategic Services. So, I mean, this is the CIA. This is the CIA we have today. A necessary evil, I suppose, you know, but there's got to be some sort of controls on this to some extent when it comes to the domestic side of things, and that seems to be what we've been lacking for a long time, and it's most evidenced through the Kennedy assassination. Just the House Select Committee stuff you can investigate clearly. I'll read you some more stuff too, but you know, the problem, even 9/11 and the rest of it, is analyzing all of this stuff is really difficult in real time. But here you've got the Kennedy assassination. It's 50 years ago. You know, everything that they did and the people that were involved, a lot of them are dead. Information's come out all over the place. You can microanalyze this. To some extent, it's become like, you know, analyzing Shakespeare or something. You've got huge volumes of opinion and criticism to take a look at and cross-reference and contrast. And so it's one of the only places, the value of it, that you can actually see the deep politics behind it and how we got to where we are. Because when you investigate the backgrounds of the intelligence agencies, like, again, I mentioned I could read it to you, but I'm just telling it to you. It's right in this book and a number of these books that you know, the CIA, when it started, it came from the OSS, and there were, there's books to read about that too. I'm just bringing these out so you know that this stuff exists out there. One of the best ones on the formation, or what happened with the OSS, a guy that was running it at the time for Roosevelt was a guy by the name of Bill Donovan. They call him Wild Bill Donovan, and he's called The Last Hero in this book by Anthony K. Brown. And it's, you know, indispensable reading for anyone who is interested in the origins and shaping of American intelligence. Edward J. Epstein, front page, New York Times book review. And Edward J. Epstein is a guy who wrote one of the first and best reviewed books after the Kennedy assassination happened, called Inquest. He was also interviewing, we're going back to the House Select Committee on Assassinations now, because I'm going for full circle. Edward J. Epstein was interviewing George de Mohrenschildt, who was, if you've read about George de Mohrenschildt at all, he was supposedly Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend. He was being interviewed, this is, I believe, what time frame would this be? It's 77, 76, 77. Oh, actually, okay. It's the end of March in 77, because the House Select Committee on Assassinations, there's so many political fights that went on to get this thing going. First, Henry Gonzalez wanted to be appointed head of the whole thing, and he wasn't, so he was on the rampage that he wasn't appointed head of it. And he got in arguments with Richard Sprague, who I told you before wanted a $6.5 million budget, and he wanted to use private investigators and didn't want the CIA and the FBI involved. And so this kind of annoyed the CIA and the FBI, so everybody was out trying to get Sprague's head knocked off. So this was the change from one Congress to another. I think it was from the 91st to the 92nd, but it doesn't matter the detail. It has to be refunded. So January 1 hits, coming from 76 to 77, and they just said, okay, we don't even know if we want to do this anymore. This thing had not really gotten started. It was just that Ponzi never stopped, because he'd been working on this since the church committee stuff. So what they did was, while they were in the interim, they lost people over this. They cut everybody's pay by 40% that was on it, and they said, we'll give you 2 months to prove you should still be alive. Okay, and then they extended it a little longer. So March 31st, 1977 was the day this was going to die, and there would be no investigation and none of the stuff that happened there, those 12 volumes, this thing that went away there, that all of it was going to go away. Gaten Fonzie got a lead. He wanted to go talk to, he'd been through the Warren Commission stuff, he'd been through a number of things. He was trying to find George de Mohrenschildt. And he went to the house that he was supposedly staying at, and George de Mohrenschildt's daughter was there. And this is March 28, March 29, somewhere in that neighborhood, or it might be a little tiny bit earlier in that last week or so. And they hadn't even gotten cards yet for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, because they just were not spending any extra money. So all he had was his old card from the Senate subcommittee that he was working on for Schweiker. So he took his card and gave it to de Mohrenschildt's daughter, who had just come in from playing tennis or whatever it was, and crossed out, you know, the thing in the end about House Select Committee on Assassinations. Gave it to de Mohrenschildt's daughter, Alexandra, all right? So then he gets a phone call within 2 days, 2 or 3 days. George de Mohrenschildt has committed suicide. And the call he gets from Bill O'Reilly. All things. Bill O'Reilly was a Texas newsman at the time, and that's who called him, was Bill O'Reilly. Calls Gaten Fonzie and says, Fonzie, what do you got to say about this? I know you're working on the Schweiker Committee and the rest of it. George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend, has committed suicide, and your business card's in his top pocket. So Alexandra had handed him the business card, and he went upstairs and shot himself, or he did. One of the two. Okay, so, and if you want to read about George de Mohrenschildt, there's a lot on him that you can cover, but it saved the committee, in effect. Another thing that saved it is, since Henry Gonzalez couldn't run the committee, he would be damned if Richard Sprague was going to stay as chief counsel. And so, you know, they had made the phone call to Stokes, Congressman Stokes, who was head of the Black Caucus that was pushing on behalf of Mrs. King and the Martin Luther King part of this to investigate the MLK assassination. Called him up and said, look, if you want this to pass, you got to get rid of Sprague. And so they did. They dumped Sprague, and that's when they brought in Robert Blakey, Bob Blakey. And Bob Blakey had a career that the last day he spoke to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was on November 22nd, 1963. They were working on still investigating the mob and all the stuff that Kennedy was working on. And Blakey goes back to the beginning of his career pretty much with Robert F. Kennedy trying to expose the mob in a variety of things. So Blakey got appointed head of the committee. They ended up with a $2.5 million budget and a 2-year time limit is what they had. So they had to wrap everything up by, their 2-year time limit was to get the whole report out, but they had to wrap up all their investigations, everything else by December of '78. So they had from basically, April 1 of '77 to December to '78 to get it done. And what Vincent Salandria had warned Gate and Ponzi about just started happening. They got a bunch of leads because they had to start using, some intelligence agency people. Blakey had done a deal with the CIA. He was trying to do a deal to get all their files, but the only way that they were going to get that is any investigator who looked at it had to sign the secrecy thing with the CIA, and the CIA also had veto power over anything that went in the final document. So, okay, and they also had veto power over who would even sit on these committees. So, okay, it's not rocket science here to figure some of this stuff out. And there's national security reasons for it, but there's, Sprague wanted an independent investigation, including no agencies, the kind of thing that Danny would run when he does an investigation, or when he worked for F. Lee Bailey. As he described, there were 3 trial lawyers in F. Lee Bailey's office and 40, private investigators. This is how these things are done. They use private investigators to dig up the information that they're going to take to court, that they're going to bring into chambers, and so on. So, and they generally have to find out far more in these kinds of cases to convict people. And Danny pointed out before when he talked about the Silkwood case, he had to take into chambers with the judge that he'd find out that we, through intelligence agencies, were smuggling weapons-grade plutonium into Iran, Israel, Brazil, and South Africa. We were doing it. You wonder why we worry about Iran? We got the receipts, So, in effect, but this is what he brought in during the Silkwood trial, and that's the stuff that wasn't allowed to be talked about, but the judge told him, I will be very lenient with regard to the damage claims and the rest of it for the family itself, and that's when they got the largest award ever. So in a lot of cases like this, if you're an independent investigator and you can find out this stuff, and you've signed no security notes with the CIA, and you've signed none of this paperwork that puts you in a federal prison as soon as your mouth opens to talk about it, you can bring this stuff into a judge like Danny did and have things like this happen for you. But in effect, you also don't get the complete story. You're just basically getting whatever was allowed to be publicly known. So, let's see, going back to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, what can I tell you after that? The paperwork I handed out again, I did mention Chris was one of the investigators that quit. Cliff Fenton was the chief investigator. The Gate and Fonzie remained the guy who got the most significant information. And of course you can read this various Oswald stuff. It's, it comes from other places too, but this was pretty hardcore. This was stuff that was vetted by an investigator in the House Select Committee on Assassination. And in Gate and Fonzie's interview of Arlen Specter, when he went to interview Specter about, the single bullet theory, I'm not going to use the M word with it, but anyway, although it would have to be that way. And his encounter with Specter, which you can read, I won't go into it, but Specter couldn't in a casual conversation explain the single bullet theory once he's had to confront the evidence of JFK's coat and shirt and where the position of the bullets were, because they were too damn low to have something go out his neck. Okay, and there's foreign documentaries. I recorded a bit of one last night that have completely different analysis of these sorts. And it's not completely different. It's very in sync with the conspiracy theorists and stuff. If you can call Gate and Fonzie a conspiracy theorist, since he did a hardcore investigation at Brewer. They still continued to try to shoot Castro, which brings up one of the primary witnesses that Gate and Fonzie had interviewed, which is Antonio Veciana. And I just brought these so you can, if you you know, if you really want to dig in the weeds. This is Fabian Escalani's books. He has another one too. He was the head of counterintelligence for Castro through the entire time. And if you want to read about all the ways they tried to kill Castro, we admitted to, I don't know how many, 40 or so, or at the time of the investigation, I think the CIA admitted to 8, something along those lines. But I brought this up in class before, but here it is, executive action, 634 ways to kill Fidel Castro. This is a guy that, other than occasionally staying in a hotel room with various girlfriends and things, was basically living like he did when he was revolutionary. He was on the move all the time, never slept in the same place twice. He would not announce, it wasn't like in this country where Fidel's coming to speak next week here. It would have been easy to kill him then because you could set the whole thing up. He would just show up wherever he showed up, and people would amass and he'd talk to them and that sort of thing. So this was a guy pretty much constantly on the run. And also, if you want to see it from the communist side, here's the JFK Cuba Files, the untold story of the plot to kill Kennedy. Now, I just read it and use this stuff as like background because they are communists. They were on the other side of this thing. And when you drill into it from both sides, it gets pretty nasty. They're obviously no saints. Just because our CIA isn't doesn't mean these guys are great or anything. And there's a number of other things that play into it for me and any researcher that's looking at this. And you have to understand the operations of the CIA, how they, although you're not completely, but the way they operate, the way they put things together. And I brought this guy up before too, L. Fletcher Prouty. He's the Mr. X from the JFK movie that Oliver Stone did. That's who it's based on. And Prouty's got some interesting info about the JFK assassination himself. He had been involved and knew personally and worked with Allen Dulles and those guys for the CIA 7 to 9 years, somewhere in that neighborhood. It goes all the way back to the writing when he was teaching a class at Yale of the National Security Act and all of the talk about that and leading up to the formation of the CIA. And then finally when he joined the Eisenhower administration when he was a lieutenant colonel, he was the focal point officer for the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to get equipment and things for the CIA. And the way it works, the way they operate in effect is they come with their laundry list for an operation. They need, you know, this many planes, whatever it is they need to Prouty. He makes sure that it gets provided. And then the only thing, it looks on paper like it came from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, but actually all the CIA has to do is give them the money for it. So it's just a straight reimbursement policy. That's how they operated on most of it. And then he describes how they would just take, at one point, they'll take a sort of junior officer that they want to have infiltrated, say, into the U.S. Department of Agriculture or any place else. They want to put people everywhere. They put a junior officer in there, get him a job with whoever the boss is at the time of a particular group at USDA or wherever it is. It doesn't matter. I mean, all through the government, there are CIA people. And they get the boss at the time to put the guy in the job, and then that boss eventually goes away and this guy's career naturally rises, and 10, 15 years later, nobody has any idea, you know, he's a CIA agent, but he's sitting at the head of some department there. And this is the focal point officer technique, which actually Allen Dulles and those guys learned from Reinhardt Galen and the Nazis. This is precisely who taught them how to do this stuff. This is well-documented stuff. Ponzi brings it up in his book at the end of it. But there's a number of places you can find it. There's a book that is real hard to get, and Danny's got one in his library. This one cost me about 125 bucks on Amazon, Project Paperclip. Now this was done by Clarence Lasby in 1971, and this one describes primarily the induction of the German scientists in the Cold War. The however many, 642 alien specialists under several programs collectively known by the code name Operation Paperclip, brought in between May of 1945 and December of 1952. And the acquisition of their valuable experience and specialized talents, and consequently their remarkable achievements, meant something in the delicate scales of the new international balance of terror. Project Paperclip deserves to emerge from myth into history. Well, this thing went away pretty fast. Yeah. Didn't want it, although at the time, a lot of people did rave about this particular book. Well, the same thing happened over on the CIA side. Dulles had brought in a number of these guys after primarily getting, I'm looking for the other book here, but he'd been dealing, a number of these Nazis knew that Hitler was gonna fall. And it was the army that had figured it out first, and then the SS and their intelligence people. So they prepared for it. They just started, and it was only organized in pockets. It isn't like, massive conspiracy, everybody in on it. These are guys that just could see the writing on the wall and were not gonna go down with the ship, right? So they funneled money into South America, Spain, all over the place, intelligence information. And Reinhardt Galen in particular was running Hitler's operation into Russia. So at one time, it is said that they had 4,000 people working for them throughout the Soviet Union that were reporting intelligence to them. So he had this information buried in 8 different places around Europe that only another guy knew by the name of Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny and his commandos, you can read about him, it's S-K-O-R-N-E-Y, Otto Skorzeny. He and his commando unit were exonerated of all charges at the Dachau trials. They were originally at the Nuremberg trials, but they got moved to Dachau because it was shown that they had absolutely nothing to do with the camps and all of that. They were truly like Green Berets, in effect. They were going out there behind enemy lines doing various things. He's the guy that rescued Mussolini. And this big, if it were an American and it were somebody that you'd all know about it, because it's an unbelievable story almost. An unbelievable thing where they came in with gliders and actually grabbed Mussolini and then left with 3 people in a 2-person glider and went into this steep descent and finally got the thing going and got out of there and saved Mussolini. But if he were an American, he would have been a heck of a hero. Yeah. Mussolini, they did hang. Yeah, eventually they caught him. This was a first rescue that they did of him, because he always knew his friend Adolf would come to the rescue, which he always said. So, but eventually, yeah, they dragged him through the streets. They did all this, but this was prior to that. But anyway, Skorzeny was exonerated primarily because there was a British officer that eventually testified to say that everything that they did, we did, and then some. Because Skorzeny was under specific instructions during the Battle of the Bulge when he and his commandos came over not to kill any American soldiers. They came over in uniforms that they'd gotten from prisoners of war, primarily. They didn't kill anybody to get them, and they were just there for misdirection purposes. Go that way instead of this way, change signs around, just confusing things. They didn't blow anything up, they didn't shoot anybody, they didn't do anything. So a British officer comes in to testify, an American lawyer who found him disgusting, but actually had listened to everything and couldn't find a thing that they did that we didn't do. And they finally found a British officer who got up there and said, we did the same things, but when we get behind German lines, we killed them, we took their uniforms, and we killed every German we possibly could while wearing German uniforms, which was a violation of all kinds of things at the time. But because a British officer was willing to admit that they did it, Skorzeny and his commandos got off the hook. Skorzeny set up shop in Spain after that because he knew where all kinds of loot and gold and the rest of it was buried. You can find out about this guy. This is not some, have to just find it on YouTube from some guy whispering in a corner, I mean, this is stuff in legitimate books out there. And whenever any ex-Nazis out there got in any trouble at all, whatever it was, Skorzeny was the guy who would write the checks for their lawyers and do a number of things. He was involved in over 700 front operations around the world, moving money and things like that around after the war. And he was the guy who had buried all of Reinhardt Galen's goods for him. So that when Dulles did the deal with Reinhardt Galen to make him head of West German intelligence for us and to penetrate the Soviet Union with their existing agents, they had to, get Skorzeny out of mothballs to go get the goods and so on too. And so it's hard to find out what he was in on. He spent most of his time in Spain. He didn't travel a lot after that. But Galen we know a lot about because Galen first came over to this country, then he was funded some $200 million for the operation that they did within the Soviet Union. But when he came over here, he was quizzed mightily by our OSS guys who were forming the CIA. How did you guys do this? And he did describe to him how they set up, how they had to legally do this stuff. And so the whole concept of having a National Security Council, a National Security Act, doing all this legalistically, making sure that there's this extra legal body separate from the legislative body and the executive body that can make these decisions. That was, ostensibly for the collection of intelligence is what it was for, but really, behind the scenes, everybody knew that they were going to be doing covert activities is what they're going to be engaged in. So this is how it happened. So they formed the National Security Council, which at the time was composed of the President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, and Secretary of State. And those 4 guys were the ones who were supposed to approve any covert actions that went on. Back then, there were only about 80 or so that happened under Truman only. And then there's a lot more under Eisenhower, which, that's publicized. Now we know that we knocked over Mossadegh in Iran in '53 and installed the Shah and all of that stuff. I mean, you can go down the list. The cast of characters that we're talking about within the CIA and the rest of it during Kennedy's times, they were JM Wave guys. They were in Miami Station. They were the ones training the anti-Castro Cubans, the Bay of Pigs, the trainers of all those guys that were involved in that. They were guys that got together in 1954, primarily most of them, to get Arbenz out of office in, I believe it was Guatemala at the time. I think it was Terry. Terry's nodding, so I've got that fact right. Let me see. I do have some notes here I want to grab. Oh, right over here. So,
could you explain why, for numbskulls, why the guy who committed suicide after his daughter gave
you know what?
why he was so scared of a House committee of...
I'll get into it. I'm not going to answer. I'm going to keep going with the stream of consciousness here. I'm not going to take questions in particular on this. So, okay, so we've got the folks that got together in '54 to do all this stuff, and this part of it was reported by a number of these folks. They eventually ended up in Eisenhower's office getting thanked for all this. Were David Sanchez Morales, who joined the team at the time, David Atlee Phillips, Henry Heckscher, Tracy Barnes, Jake Esterline, and Jerry Drawler. Let's see, there were some other folks involved as well, but don't have all the names there. But this is the same cast of characters that ended up under Ted Shackley in the Miami station, the JM-Wave, Miami station. The CIA has all those little acronyms. I've read about what it could potentially mean before, but it escapes me right now. But David Sanchez Morales and those guys trained these guys that went into the Bay of Pigs. They got to know these guys well. They were all on the same team. Everybody was a patriot going in there wanting to take out Castro, so that when it all went south, it made a lot of people angry, real angry. And you can go back and see promises Kennedy had made at different times after the Bay of Pigs. He went into an entire football stadium filled with Cubans and told them their flag would fly again in Havana, and they're all cheering. So to them, truly, Kennedy was a traitor. I mean, in fact, yeah.
Did the Cuban exiles know that Kennedy repeatedly said he would not install military intervention?
Well, the thing is they don't know the subtle details, okay? If you have the book that can tell you a lot of this, because there's a whole section in the back and someone that talked that goes into Henry Heckscher and Tracy Barnes in particular. And Tracy Barnes was known for bad-mouthing JFK so much and promoting so much bad propaganda, negative thinking amongst the anti-Castro Cubans that they didn't, no subtlety to it at all. They just wanted Havana and they wanted Cuba back, and they didn't care how. And Kennedy was positioned by the people they were talking to directly as the guy that stopped it. So they were in effect viewing him as a communist after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he did a deal with Castro, or he did a deal with Khrushchev, and he was potentially not going to invade. And as Danny told you, they went out and took out those various bases that those guys were all training in and everything after that. So, all right, the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Can we just put this, however you put this thing up, so I can now just draw speeches? I'm glad I remember enough of this stuff, because I don't like reading to you. So you got two people here. Chris.
Can you turn on the light? Good call.
I think I got that right. If you remember nothing else from the House Select Committee on Assassinations, dig deep into both of these people and their testimony and so on that was at least given to, they were misrepresented in the report. Things, of course, Okay, in the actual report itself, it was sanitized, they surrounded the edges around it and so on. But in effect, Sylvia, okay, who's a very credible witness, okay, I'm not taking questions.
It's misspelled.
No, Sylvia?
S-Y-L.
Oh, sorry, okay, well, you can get that part. Little dyslexia. I am a salesman, so. All right. So Sylvia, in effect, says there was the three dudes who came to her door, and one of them was introduced to her as Leon Oswald. Okay, and he fit the general description when eventually shown pictures and so on. Once she saw him after, you know, the assassination, she was like, "Holy crap, that was the guy that was at the door." It wouldn't be weird, you know, maybe, except that he was supposedly, according to the guy that was deputy station chief in Mexico City at the time, a guy by the name of David Atlee Phillips, who was eventually running Western Hemisphere operations. You can check me on my Phillips spelling too, on L's and all that, I don't know. Close enough, you'll get it down. And David Atlee Phillips at the Mexico station is the primary source of information who said that Oswald went down to Mexico City, was going to the Cuban embassy and the Soviet embassy and trying to get into Cuba and trying to get back to the Soviet Union, and this person raised a big ruckus down there. You can read about all of that stuff. David Atlee Phillips puts him in Mexico City at the same time he was at Sylvia Odio's door.
Okay, what time and date is that?
No, you can find it.
61, I think.
Yeah, it's around that time frame. I mean, I do have it, I got all that stuff written down. I don't feel like going through it. I'll give you the highlights and you can go through. It'll just be a lot faster. So, chronologies, there's a zillion of them, okay. So there was a big disconnect here, and it just came down to the credibility of this very, very, very terrified potential witness. And, you know, her life was kind of turned upside down by all of this stuff. And she didn't really want to have much ever to do with it, which is one of the reasons why she was highly credible, too. And it's the short story. There's a lot more to it, and you can read about that. Antonio Veciana, he, interestingly enough, was an accountant. He was involved in banks in Cuba and so on, and was a very well-respected guy. He was also the head of an anti-Castro group, which was one of the most well-advertised. I told you the sort of semi, you can tell the way I do that stuff. But anyway, Alpha 66. I don't write a lot on boards, so. But Alpha 66 was one of the most successful anti-Castro Cuban paramilitary forces, and they had a lot of help. Okay, we did assist them quite a bit, CIA help and so on. And interesting genesis of the name. I'll ask the question to you guys. Does anybody know why it's called Alpha 66? Okay.
1966?
Nah. way earlier than that. Okay. It was Alpha because it's the beginning and the end for Castro. In 66, because Antonio Veciana was an accountant, and he'd signed up 66 accountants in the group of the whole bunch of people that signed up, and so he was pretty proud of that, so he called it Alpha 66. So that's the number of accountants that were in Alpha 66 as a group. There were many more of them there. Some other things about him. He goes down as becoming a personal friend of Gaten Fonzi. He spent more time with this guy than he did anybody else and chasing him down for an extremely good reason. His CIA handler's name, over and over again, that he told everybody, was a guy by the name of Maurice Bishop. Okay. And when they finally had sort of tracked everything down about Maurice Bishop, and you can go, I mean, Gaten Fonzi, when he died, he was 76 years old. There's a big article in the New York Times about him. If you go into the large syllabus, which I wrote, the big one that you've got for 145 pages, you'll see the links to all this stuff. And the New York Times article talks about Gaten Fonzi as being known as Ahab. you know, because he's going to chase Moby Dick to the ends of the earth. And what he was called that by G. Robert Blakey, who was the chief counsel on the committee, because he wouldn't let go of this. He said, you know, you're like Ahab chasing the white whale, you know. And what it was he kept trying to absolutely, positively verify that Maurice Bishop was in fact David Atlee Phillips. So, and he eventually did get corroboration. He got corroboration from people that said it outright, inadvertently. He talked to one CIA officer toward the end of the book that he just was having a conversation with, and he knew he was a guy that was operational in the late 70s, and he went and he looked in a set of code names of aliases that people uses, and he did verify that it was David Atlee Phillips. He also heard it from another person. He could never get Veciano to admit it outright, but he had arranged on a couple of occasions, one in particular, for Veciano and for David Atlee Phillips to actually meet, so that he could have them meet. And so they go to this dinner, and it's described in the book, and it's great. Because all Veciano did through the whole meal is just eyeball the guy. And he was a good actor. He would always, Atlee Phillips, whenever he would go into a new area, he'd always join an acting troupe. He loved to be in local theater, so he was a pretty good actor. So it held for a while, but eventually, even Gaten Fonzie was there. His hands were he was losing his frickin' marbles because this guy just wouldn't. He was just eyeballing him to death. But Veciano had signed all of the security documents that the CIA requires. He'd signed all of it. He'd signed things that said they could throw him away totally if he ever ratted them out. So he would never say anything more than, you know, I mean, he said a lot more, but he, in the beginning, he said, well, it kind of looks like him. You know, and that's the most he would go. But he had already spent 26 months in jail on a charge that he was totally framed, completely framed. It's pretty obvious that he was framed before that, because he didn't cease and desist, okay? Kennedy might have said, stop attacking the Castro and the rest of it, and the CIA and everybody else still wanted him to, but there came a certain point where not even the CIA or anybody wanted Veciano continuing to attack Castro, right? And he wouldn't stop. He was just bound and determined. That was his primary thing, take this guy down. And so he continued to be involved in that stuff, so they locked him up. They put him out of commission for 26 months. He came back out, he got kick-started again. He's a successful businessman. He was just too good at what he did not to be. And really proud Cuban family and real tight family, and Fonzie gets to know them, and you find out all the details of finally, basically, you know, in effect proving that that guy was that guy. And since he was his handler, it was direct CIA handling of Alpha 66 and, you know, connections to a number of other things. Now, the biggie, okay, here it is. So this is all good stuff, but here's the monster on this side. So we got an Oswald thing here, right? So a Leon Oswald, be he a double or Oswald, who cares? If he's a double for Oswald, then there's definitely conspiracy going on, because they're creating doubles for Oswald that are going to be at the door. So no matter how you cut it, it becomes a conspiracy once you're involving that sort of thing. So Veciano would meet Maurice Bishop at various places of Bishop's design. It was never a case where Veciano could say, you know, meet me at the coffee shop here. He always had to act on the instructions of his handler. So Bishop had him meet at this hotel. It's in the book. Can't remember the name. But he goes there, and Maurice Bishop, David Atlee Phillips, is talking to Lee Harvey Oswald at length. And then they go outside and talk on the sidewalk at length. And so Veciano told Gaetan Fonzie during the House Select Committee in the Senate, he told him back when he was on the Senate subcommittee about it, that yes, David Atlee Phillips knows Lee Harvey Oswald, talking to him, all the rest of it. And Atlee Phillips also, deputy director of station in Mexico City at that time, who's the one who's giving the information that says, hey, Oswald's down here trying to get back into Russia and Cuba, and the rest of it. Okay, so You have him, either a double or Oswald at the door at the same time. He's saying he's in Mexico. Eventually the CIA could produce nothing. The photos of the guy, if you guys have looked at this stuff at all, the photos that they did give him look nothing like Oswald. They claim their cameras weren't working that day. Ponzi went down and he eventually talked to an agent said, who actually told him, a guy from the CIA, he said, ridiculous. He said, we have redundancy with all our cameras. We have cameras all over the place. They couldn't all possibly be not working that day. So Oswald was not there. Okay, I mean, it's not a big bold conclusion I'm making, but he may not have been at Sylvia Odio's door either. But somebody, either he or somebody who looked a hell of a lot like him, who was introduced as Leon Oswald, was at the door. Now, the other bizarre part about this is one of the other guys who was at the door that she knows, and it's in there, you can look it up, calls her the next day and starts talking, and this is before the assassination happened, about how nuts this Leon Oswald is, and basically saying the rest of them don't have the nerve to kill Kennedy, and he's a great shot with a rifle. I mean, he talked it up ahead of time, which 6 of one, half a dozen the other didn't mean anything to Sylvia at the time, but then if she sees the Kennedy assassination, sees Oswald's face, and then remembers that, it was very interesting that Oswald didn't say much of anything when he was there at the door. He didn't say much of anything when he was at her door, but here she sees the face of that. Yeah, go ahead. I'll give you one.
Why were they at her door?
She'd been part of the anti-Castro Cuban group. I mean, she wasn't fond of Fidel either. Her family had been displaced, and they were there about her helping raise funds, as I recall.
She was a part of
He's nodding. Yes, it was fundraising.
She was a part of the Alpha 66?
No, I don't know that. She was just friendly to, I mean, she was raising 4 kids. She had a German husband that had abandoned her after things went south financially. He took off, went back to Europe, and so she was just trying to raise her kids living with her sister, basically. But she'd been involved, and she'd always tried to help out, in different ways with the cause, the rest of it. There are a number of different groups. Alpha 66 is just like, there's the DRE, there's a number of them that were around at the time, and they were all infiltrated, but this one got the best press, was, whether they actually were as successful as they were at doing a lot of the things they did, they were at least purported to be, so that they could continue to keep up. So these are the 2 key issues that came out of the House Select Committee on Assassinations in real time. Okay, so a lot of the other stuff I'm telling you was not found out until more evidence came out during the Assassination Records Review Board period, which is post-1992 running through 1998. But during the House Select Committee on Assassinations, those 2 bits. The other thing, okay, let's just go to numbers. The House Select Committee on Assassinations said there were 692 witnesses on Dealey Plaza that day. 692 potential people that they could have a conversation with about what did you think happened. The Warren Commission took testimony from 552 people. The most comprehensive investigation, blah, 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 like Gerald Ford, did 552 people. They weren't all the people on Dealey Plaza. They ignored a lot of people on Dealey Plaza. They ignored the people that were closest to the assassination on Dealey Plaza, okay? They didn't want to talk to a lot of them because it did conflict with what the Warren Commission was going to report. So just the numbers game of it. Now, along the way, when they were trying to get any traction at all, they got their legs cut out from under them. They were up to 118 investigators for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Remember, let's see, I believe it was 83 Warren Commission, 150 full-time FBI. The 83 don't quote me on completely. You can look that up of how many people are actually helping them in addition to it. It could be more, could be less. But they were up to 118, and then they had knocked back, they got down into the 80s, I don't know what it was, with the first cutback. And they cut all but 4 of the Kennedy investigators. And because the Black Caucus was pretty strong at the time and the Martin Luther King stuff was going on, the Martin Luther King side was still more staffed. They had more people working on that. Although that, in the final report, they didn't have time to write up absolutely everything that they had on everything when they finally did the report. And then the Kennedy side, like I said, all the investigators were promised a chapter, including Chris, who just got fed up with the whole damn thing and split. And but you've got his notes. None of the work that Gaetan Fonzi did, very little of it ended up in the final report. It was a rework job that Bob Blakey did because he had such a, he was immersed in the mob. I mean, he had worked with Robert F. Kennedy, and he'd worked on all this stuff to go after the mob and the rackets and the labor unions and all the corruption that had been going on back then, that any time that he could bend the thing toward the mob, he wanted to bend it toward the mob. Now, you understand he has a really good relationship with the CIA, and he's obviously, if he got a chance to look at all those records, he signed all the documents that, he signed the documentation that said, I can't say anything you guys don't want me to. So he was fully cooperating with the CIA. So Robert Blakey was looking at his career, he was looking at the job at hand, and he viewed himself as the servant of the 12 congressmen that were on the committee. And those congressmen wanted this thing to end as fast as possible. This was not helping any of their careers, at all. They weren't real happy about it. There's some quotes I have over here from some of these dudes at the time. Let me see if I can. One of the Congress people in particular.
Did they investigate Bobby's assassination at all?
Well, he wasn't. Who did they investigate? I don't even know if there was anything formal on Bobby. I think it was just the LA Police Department.
Yeah.
It was about it. That's all they did with him. And they just basically did an open shutter on Sirhan, but there were more bullets fired than he had in his gun. But
So it wasn't at all part of so Bobby's assassination wasn't at all part of the House. Why was it left out if they're going to?
No, because the House Select Committee on Assassinations was specifically formed. Initially, it was formed to go after, to re-examine the JFK evidence, to open another thing, get other testimony. Martin Luther King, because the Black Caucus was pushing for it, and Coretta King was pushing like crazy, and a lot of noise coming at the time to investigate it. And they were going to investigate the attempted assassination of Governor George Wallace at the time, but they just didn't have time, money, or anything, so he got just pushed to the side. So it was exclusively focused on JFK and MLK. That was it. People weren't making all those connections. The connections that were to do with the CIA and Janeway and the mob and all of that stuff that could potentially lead up to Bobby as well. I mean, there's a string of things that could lead up to that. That wasn't known. They were just discovering who these people were then. It was during the House Select Committee times when they were really finding out. David Sanchez Morales wasn't thought of as much of anything in the early part of the investigation. It was only when they found out all the best stuff when they had no time left to follow up on anything. They had 2 months left, November and December, to wrap up the investigation, and they were just told, don't go after anything that's going to take you longer than 2 months to wrap up. So they just stopped it entirely. Go ahead.
I want to read about Bobby Kennedy's assassination. Get the book Nemesis, the story of Aristotle Onassis. It's in there.
Okay, I didn't know about that, but
It
okay.
just seems suspect, doesn't it?
Sure, but
it's called the House Select Committee on.
Yeah, but it's not an open forum. These things are planned ahead of time, and they have a charter, and that's what it was. So, come on, we're talking about Congress. So, it's not an open thing. Even when they do, this isn't the kind of thing where they cross-examine a witness either. They find a line of questioning and they pursue it. All the questions are set up ahead of time. They're vetted ahead of time. You can't even spontaneously follow up on anything you've just found out. You have to just ask the questions that you've got listed here in the order that you have them. And that's all you're allowed to do in these committee meetings. That's how they investigate these things. So the investigators are covering all sorts of things, and then they call some of these people up and they don't even ask them the crucial questions that would prove the points of the investigators. Draw your own conclusions. So, let's see. I wanted to find, shoot. Well, I will have to grab it off of here, because it's one of the guys did come out and actually talk about some of the things that went on during the committee meetings. Anyway, I just leave it. But these are the two primary things from the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I'm trying to think of something else that's relevant and specific to the time. You go ahead with the questions if you want to. Yeah.
What happened? I mean, they made a conclusion that there was a conspiracy. It was sent to the Department of Justice.
Right.
What happened?
They just didn't follow up. Nothing.
Who?
The Justice Department, no one had any interest, none. It's politically, it can destroy your career. You go after that stuff. You suddenly, problems start happening to you. As Hunter S. Thompson once put it, your life will turn into a series of unfortunate accidents. So I do have a few more things that I can do into here. They did call eventually, well, okay, the deaths. Let's talk about this because it's glaring. Okay, this is huge. Okay, the number of people that ended up dead, it was to some extent, although not complete. I told you about the first one, George de Mohrenschildt, Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend, who, when he spoke in front of the Warren Commission, gave 121 pages of testimony, I believe, that was completely sealed, so that nobody could take a look at it. Danny tells me he knows somebody that's got copies of some of the transcripts of it right now. But, so de Mohrenschildt was supposedly his best buddy. And although I kind of like that Richard Belzer did this book, Hit List, there's inaccuracies in it in some of the technical details, because he says that de Mohrenschildt killed himself shortly after he was subpoenaed by the House Select Committee. He wasn't even subpoenaed. Gaten Fonzie, it hadn't even gotten rolling. Like I said, he'd had to write on his business card. He had to cross out the Senate subcommittee information to write in House Select Committee, hand the business card, and the guy commits suicide within, whatever it was, 2 to 4 days after that. And he was being interviewed at the time by Epstein, the guy that wrote Inquest. So I have no idea what that interview was about, but he was being interviewed at the time that Gaten Fonzie was at the house looking for him. So.
Could you help us understand why he would be so freaked out? I mean, I'm sorry.
De Mohrenschildt?
Stupid, yeah.
Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend, who was an oil man, who had been, I mean, you can read about him. To go into him, there's whole books on George de Mohrenschildt. There's one called Our Man in Haiti, about him and his CIA affiliations and the business he did for the CIA in Haiti. George de Mohrenschildt was just one of many folks that had CIA and intelligence affiliations that surrounded the Oswalds. Lee and Marina were ensconced in CIA-connected people that were connected to the white Russian community. Yeah.
Yeah, when you read the material he's talking about, de Mohrenschildt talks about his paranoia about what he knows and being killed if he makes it public. So he was tremendously frightened.
Well, he had, in his pocket at the time in his address book was George W. Poppy, in quotes, Bush. He had Bush's phone number on him. He also had written a letter when Bush had been made head of CIA congratulating him, to which Bush responded. So he personally knew George Bush. When during World War II, when he was doing different operations for whoever through South America during World War II, he wandered around with a letter from Nelson Rockefeller in his pocket. That's how he wandered around. He was He was an engineer. He came from an affluent family. He was originally, his name was it was George von Mohrenschildt. He changed it to de Mohrenschildt for whatever reasons. Yeah.
I don't recall exactly where I read this, but didn't Mohrenschildt also write a letter to George Bush like I don't know, a few months before he was killed or died, saying like, I know I'm being watched, like it's just tormenting me and my wife, like please leave us alone.
Well, it wasn't. Yes, I've heard about that as well. Yeah, that he did send a letter
Bush
to Bush.
Responded saying like, as far as my knowledge goes, there's nothing.
I don't know anything that's going on with it. Yeah. You're indeed, yeah. So there were 2 letters. Thanks for that one. But the number of folks that died that were going to be is much larger than what Belzer points out. In fact, they were going to bring David Sanchez Morales in for a conversation because as he got older, he got drunker and he got loose lips every now and then, and he said enough things, which is why you get the whole chapter in Someone Would Have Talked, which is on your reading list. That let's see. And in the chapter, it's chapter 8, and it's the exact quote that David Sanchez Morales said in front of 2 men who verified it to Gaetan Fonzi. after he was on a rant about, how much he hated JFK and what a traitor and all the rest of it. Then he sat down and he said, well, we took care of that SOB, didn't we? That was right out of David Sanchez Morales, the chief of operations for JM Wave at Miami Station on November 22nd, 1963. And he reported to Ted Shackley, going back in a little history lesson. Danny's pointed this out before. Ted Shackley was born in Germany, came over to this country, and then he was in World War II. I believe he was a corporal at the time when he was over in Germany, and when Reinhardt Galen had turned himself in, they had needed a translator for Galen, and Shackley was that translator. So, and Galen was the spy master in Germany. Well, we've since learned a number of things, since then, that there was a lot of inaccurate information coming out of Galen's organization too, and that, in fact, the Nazis he had over there, right, were gaming some of the information to escalate the conflict between the US and the USSR. The Nazis were always not too thrilled with the Soviets, and there's been a lot of information about double agents and about bad info coming through the Berlin operating base, primarily. And there's a whole section in the appendix here called It All Started with Bob, the Berlin operating base. And it's where David Sanchez Morales, Ted Shackley, Dulles was over there, managing and so on, those guys. All these guys, Henry Heckscher, Tracy Barnes, all the guys I mentioned before that were on all these teams to either assassinate or undermine the administrations of these various countries. They were all connected to this Berlin operating base. And so they all knew Galen. Shackley obviously was, right at his knee. And if you follow Shackley's career, he did write, you can read his autobiography, I have it on here, and you can sort of match it up with the other stuff that is about him to see how it all compares. And he's a real world traveler. I mean, he was running the Phoenix program out of Southeast Asia and assassinating all those people he's in Laos doing that as well. He's all over the place. Yeah.
Is there a common thread or theme of any kind that connects this hit list? Is there an underlying?
Well, the hit list is just all an in-depth investigation of the mysterious deaths of witnesses to the JFK assassination. That's what this whole thing is. I merely targeted Lewis Nichols, FBI, Alan Belmont, FBI, James Cadigan, FBI, Donald Kaler, FBI, J.M. English, FBI, William Sullivan, FBI, Sam the Man Giancana, mob, Johnny Roselli, mob, William D. Pauley, CIA, mob and hire, Chuck Nicoletti, mob, George de Mohrenschildt, CIA, hire, President Carlos Prio Socaras, he's the guy that was in there before Batista, who was involved with the CIA, with the mob, running guns. Jack Ruby was also a gun runner with the mob, taking guns into Castro. There was a point when we wanted Castro to take over because we knew Batista was too nasty and that was falling apart. We just didn't get, we discovered it too late. So we were trying to get a more moderate guy in there so that we could keep Havana and keep things going, but he was just too nasty and we couldn't do it. So it all, but we were instigating even then. We were helping, funnel things in there to put this guy back in potentially, and he was partnered with Castro to do it. And there were people that were convinced that Castro was a communist back then. Like David Sanchez Morales was working, he was working in the American embassy in Havana at the time, undercover, with an embassy title. And he was absolutely insistent, Castro's a communist, what the hell are we doing with this guy, The rest of it, but we helped get him installed. We wanted somebody else, but we were going for this, and he ended up in there. So there's a number of folks, there's a bigger list than this, and you can find the number of people that, a subpoena to the House Select Committee on Assassinations once they're taking testimony equal to suicide or a heart attack or something of some kind very quickly after they got their subpoenas. So it was hard to find out things, yeah.
When Giancana and Roselli were murdered, wouldn't that have incited outrage within the mob?
I'm so glad you asked me this question. Okay, so here's what happened. Roselli, you need memory triggers.
He was found in the ocean.
Oh, it's worse. It's worse. Jack Anderson was a big newsman at the time who would publish things, insider information. He took over a guy named Drew Pearson's column, who was famous way back when. So Jack Anderson was publishing, I think it was in the Washington Post, his articles would primarily appear. And Johnny Roselli was talking to Jack Anderson, and he was promoting, you will find that the anti-Castro Cubans and the mob in particular, they got specific ideas about who did it. And Roselli was always trying to push the Castro did it theory all the time. And what he was basically saying, he said this elaborate whole thing where here we had Operation Mongoose and RFK sponsored this program and John Kennedy too knew about it and they all knew about it and they created these assassination teams. And then Castro got a hold of them and mind controlled them and turned them into assassins who killed JFK. Now this is literally the story in a nutshell that Jack Anderson, or that Johnny Roselli was peddling to Jack Anderson, okay? Jack Anderson publishes this stuff. Shortly thereafter, from what I understand, and I've read a lot of details about this, Johnny Roselli was knocked out first, or not knocked out, he was immobilized with a drug, so that he was awake. Smothered, while being smothered, shot, and then they chopped him up into pieces and put him in a barrel and made sure that he would surface and be found as a message to anybody else that was going to start talking to these people, basically. Sam Giancana had said a couple of things too, and he'd already talked before the House Select Committee a couple of times, but it was minor stuff. He was being called back for a third time, and he was found with either 6 or 7 shots around his mouth. For some reason, they did it there. So before about a week before he was going into the House Select Committee. So mobsters were dying the way mobsters do if they got called to testify, like Roselli and so on. And there's a whole collection of them. It's interesting to see if you look at any of these people, take a look at when they died and how they died. I mean, it's interesting. Santos Trafficante lived to a ripe old age. And he did get called between the House Select Committee, and it was a big deal that they had him there and they're bringing him in, and then he just pled the fifth the whole time he was there. But he lived. Yeah, anyway.
Didn't the guy who saw Lee Harvey Oswald get into the station wagon, supposedly, didn't he die as well? Is he on that list?
He may be. I was, there's.
Because he did die, I know he
It's
died.
a long list.
He died later on.
Sure.
They started putting him on antidepressants, and then he was found shot with a bullet in his chest that was supposed to be self-inflicted, which is kind of weird. And
there was a lot of that going on.
He was also wasted at the time.
Yeah. The older researchers, the one who was probably the most tenacious, he did the most publishing, he lived close by, he was able to look things, the guy by the name of Penn Jones Jr., P-E-N-N Jones Jr., and he published 4 volumes called Forgive My Grief, Volume 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can get a few of them as PDFs online, and I believe Volume 3 is when he details, even way back then in the 60s when he wrote it, over 100 people that were killed after the Kennedy assassination. And he was publishing a newsletter on either a bi-weekly or whatever basis at the time. He ran the Midlothian newspaper. Midlothian, Texas is where he was. So he's one of the early researchers who was really digging deep. He is one of the ones that comes out and talks about the night before, the party at Clint Murchison's house on the 21st. And he lists the guest lists of Clint Murchison Jr., Governor John Connally, H.L. Hunt, oilman, George Brown, who was head of Brown and Root, the primary construction company that built most of our stuff in Vietnam, who was the precursor of Halliburton. Mac Wallace, who was popularly known as LBJ's hitman, he was a murderer. John J. McCloy, who was on the Warren Commission, who was also head of Chase Manhattan Bank, and at the time was head of the Council on Foreign Relations. Cliff Carter, who was LBJ's lawyer. Richard M. Nixon, who was in town at the time. J. Edgar Hoover, Clive Tolson, his boyfriend, let's not mince words. Carlos Marcello, who was running the Texas and Louisiana Mafia at the time. Joe Savello, who was the specific Dallas Mafia figure at the time. Jack Ruby, who ran a lot of nightclubs and reported to Savello, Earl Cabell, who was the mayor of Dallas and the brother. This is not, you know, something that's in the House Select Committee notes. This is in Penn Jones, who lived down there and was talking to individual people. Larry Campbell, Jimmy Hoffa's lieutenant. Amon D. Carter Jr., the owner of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, a newspaperman. Bill Carter, the sheriff of Dallas County. Clint Peoples, U.S. Marshal, and R.L. Thornton, the former Dallas mayor. Now, there's people he didn't say were there too, but this is who Penn Jones, if you can go back and dig through all of that, said was there at Clint Murchison's house in the meeting. And if you look online at the videos, if you look online at the videos, you will see LBJ's girlfriend at the time saying that he came out of that party and he said, you know, the Kennedy brothers will never embarrass me again and all that. You can, if you take a look at the big syllabus, you can look at all this stuff on video. And like, look, this is hearsay at this point. I mean, even what I'm talking, you know, I mean, he's getting it from people that did not sit under oath. I mean, that information I just gave you was not part of the House Select Committee. But there's a lot of backstory and a lot of stuff that those investigators themselves, had access to, and the investigators were looking at that shaped their investigations. And the fact that each one of them was promised a chapter, and they did their homework and did all this work and did vet things, and they handed all that information in, and it was completely tossed out and rewritten in favor of a mob did it. There were 4 bullets, but 1 missed from the grassy knoll theory. It's kind of interesting. Go ahead.
What was the long list of names that you just read off?
Oh God, I'm not doing it again.
No, I don't want you to read it off.
Oh, it was the list of names that Penn Jones Jr. said were at Clint Murchison's house on November 21st, 1963 at a party that was held there the night before.
Oh, okay.
And if you read, I mean, you know, all this stuff is out there. I mean, if you're tracking any of the book lists and so on, what you'll find is you'll find the people that say, you know, LBJ did it. You'll find the people that say the CIA did it. You'll find the people that say the mob did it. You'll find them say it's a combo platter of the above. If you look at the things that the House Select Committee on Assassinations say, they just start talking about the deficiencies of the Secret Service, you know, that day in particular. They slammed them pretty hard because they just went against procedure so much. So they took a beating in there. That the FBI was not complete in their investigation, that they didn't explore the conspiracy angle enough, that they flat out just, you know, didn't have enough time. They did this very rushed thing, and then they wrote, you know, by the next September, the whole Warren Commission thing's done before the election. It wasn't even a full year. So, you know, the investigation was cursory at best. And as you know from previous lectures and enough documentation, right, from LBJ to J. Edgar Hoover and the rest of it, they were given a directive to basically, you know, make sure everybody believes Oswald did it. You know, I mean, in effect, target this thing at the dude. So, and yet they had their reasons, and they can, you know, we were, you know, Cuban Missile Crisis. It was just, you know, 13 months before that, we just almost blew up the world. And it was just that the deal that Kennedy made for it wasn't very palatable to a lot of people.
That's close to time.
All right, so.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.